Okay, welcome. I'm your host, Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua, and this is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And today we have as our guest Dr. Valerie Grimm. She is professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. She has been a faculty member of this department since 1990. She is formerly the chair of the department and has also served as director of graduate studies and director of undergraduate studies. She has published widely in the area of African American rural and agricultural history, rural studies and foreign policy, and rural American culture and land ownership, as well as other areas of interest. She is currently the president of the National Council for Black Studies. Dr. Grimm is also completing a book on the 1890s Black land grant universities and the struggle for community. Welcome, Dr. Grimm. It is a true pleasure to have you on my show. Um, you and I, we go way back, right? Uh,
Yes.
and I miss those dinners and walks we used to have. You, I, Jeanette Davison, and our dear departed brother Ahmed
Yeah,
Rockman. Boy, we had some times.
we did.
Um, you know, uh, I think we talked about this, but you and I are also both graduates at Tougaloo College.
You know, I I think so, but somehow it got lost in all our conversations. So when I saw that again, I was like, "Yeah, really?" I just remember all these other great conversations we had. But now that I know you are, it makes sense. Your genius makes sense to me.
And I could say the same. Tougaloo they did a great job,
Yeah, I think
tremendously
so.
great job in producing folk. So, Valerie, and we're informal in this space, so
No
I'm more
problem.
likely to call you sister than doctor. But that's not to belittle your accomplishments. It's just to show that we also want to talk in a family way. Um,
Absolutely. No problem.
Now, I have a tendency to interrupt for the purposes of getting clarity and sometimes to push you. But my goal here is to encourage you to be comprehensive in your answers, but be as succinct as
Sure.
you can because we got quite a few questions and there's always going to be follow up that I want to talk about. The other piece that I think is unique to my show is that I've been deeply influenced by William Cross and the theory of negrescence, Black identity formation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm always interested in how people came to be who they are now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know the kinds of processes, the things that they read, the people who influenced them, the social activities, movement activities that they were involved in that all come together to make them who they are today in terms of what Bill Cross called that Negro to Black conversion experience. Um, and I'm really interested in your your intellectual interest and your political outlook. So, if you could take us back to the place that you spent your formative years,
Okay.
the time in which you went through that developmental process, and talk about your class background and the role of race in
Mm-hmm.
you becoming who you are.
Okay. Thank you, brother. Um, I grew up in, first of all, let me say thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to this conversation between us. And I always enjoy seeing you and just engaging in a dialogue with you about whatever we talk about. Uh, all kinds of stuff on those long walks when we were at NCBS. So I grew up in Mississippi. I'm a native of Mississippian. I was born in Sunflower County, Mississippi, made famous by the now deceased Fannie Lou Hamer, whom I also grew up around in Sunflower County. I grew up in between Sunflower and Leaf Floyd counties, in the Mississippi Delta area of the state of Mississippi. So my background is rural. My background is farming. My parents have a farm. We still have a farm. My education was largely segregated in the sense that from kindergarten through 12th grade, I went to all Black schools, and these were not the schools in the city, but they were kind of like the county schools, but they were fully developed school. They just weren't the schools in town. Um, I I grew up on a farm with my parents, 9 siblings. My parents had 5 girls and 5 boys. Um, let's say 7 of us are college educated, some with others in addition to me with graduate degrees. Education was very important in my family and to my parents who didn't have an opportunity to get a real education back in those days when Black kids finished the 8th grade. They were done with education. They went to work or they went north and did things of that sort. So how I grew up was important to me. My parents realized that we were maturing in a deeply segregated racist place. I grew up not very far from where Emmett Till was killed, and so that murder of that child never left my parents' mind, in the sense that every time we left the farm and left our rural community. I grew up in a rural community of Black landowners, which was rare for a lot of people during this time period, both in actuality, but also in the narrative that was being told about who Black people were, as if we were born just to be laborers and sharecroppers. And so I grew up around people who owned land, who had property, who contributed tremendously to developing a community for us so that we wouldn't feel like we were less than. So conversation about race when I grew up was only about acknowledging that some white people held attitudes about Black people, but my parents always taught us that before God we were equal people, and that we didn't have to spend our time hating them, but spend our time believing that there was something that God had given us that we could do and that we could achieve on our own if we worked hard. Now, working hard is, Lord, was a thing that we lived by on that farm, but it also translated to being able to work hard in other spaces. And so I think the most important lesson, to be succinct, that I learned from my parents was that they would not let us use our strength and our power hating. And my mother would especially say, nobody's worth hating because of what it did to you. And they drilled that within us, even when there were some very, very contested moments growing up in Mississippi with whites. My mother would say, the answer is not to hate. The answer is to understand that there is a better way and that you can have a better way, even better than us. And then they try to equip us to do better, to be better.
Yeah. Can I ask you a quick? Well, one, can I get you to move a bit to the right because you're being cut off?
This way?
Yeah, recenter yourself. There you go. Right there. That's perfect. Stay
Okay.
there.
And so my parents wouldn't let us spend
But I
time.
also want to ask you a question.
Okay. Yes, sure.
So the question is the time period,
Right.
because what your parents is teaching you, I know it goes back in Black tradition, but it does sound very much like the civil rights era.
I grew
So
up
can you clarify?
yes, I was born in the 1960s. And so my parents were very alive and very awake in the 1960s. My father was one of few Black folks who had the opportunity to be the first ones to vote. And he I believe it was in 1960, he voted on the federal marshals in Mississippi. Yes. And so he understood the power of that. He understood the importance of education. And so I grew up in the 1960s, but my older siblings were born in the 1950s, early 1950s. And so the 1950s, 1960s, the height of the movement in the South during this time period. But I wasn't of age in the sense that I was a teenager yet, but I was old enough to know what was going on because Fannie Lou Hamer would come to our churches and tell us. And so so my mother would say things like, you remember that story that she told about being beaten? Can't you see that even with all of that, they wouldn't make her hate, because she used her power to love and to push forward and to push through that. And those were the kinds of things my mother would use as an example to say there is no real power in hating, only destruction to oneself and to others. And so as I matured, I went to high school in Greenwood, Mississippi, because I live right across the county line. You know, in Mississippi, if you live across the county line, they'll bus you 40 miles
Yeah.
to the county school, even though you 3 miles down the school, down the road from another school. So I rode this long bus ride to school every day in high school. And so I went to Tougaloo College and wanted to be a lawyer first. But then I took a couple classes in African American history and realized that there was a story that was being told in textbooks that were not representative of an experience that I knew, which was a whole bunch of Black farmers who owned land. And most of American history at this time period in the 1970s was in the process of being revived by kind of conscientious scholars who were trying to tell the story of Black people lives from the perspective of Black people. And I didn't see that story of Black folks owning hundreds of acres of land and building community and building parks in those little rural areas so their kids could have places to do recreational things. And so that is how I ended up in history, because I wanted to contribute to the narrative of Black people in a place where I thought a story wasn't being told. So my background, it probably would be what I would call working, because we worked at farm, but I came from a working background where my parents owned land and hundreds of hogs. We had a commercial hog business. We had a food product
So
business.
let me ask you, did your family, Fannie Lou Hamer has started Freedom Farms, and she gave out hogs to Black farmers to get them started. Was your family one of those families? Okay.
No, my father started his hog business from his father. And so and then he just developed. Hogs are very fertile. A litter can have 12 or 13 pigs, and you have 3 or 4 hogs having pigs, every 6 months. And man, it was so many hogs. I declare sometimes it was like we lived in Hog City. But that was part of the way in which he had he made money to supplement what we were doing on the farm, because with farming you can have a $1 million crop in the ground, and the rain comes and lose it all. So my father and my mother always had other businesses going. My mother had a dairy business. My father had a hog business. We as children, they gave us a food business. So for whatever we wanted to have, we grew for the food market: cucumbers, okra, peas, peanuts, and those were our crops that we picked and sold, so we could buy bicycles and do the things that we wanted to do.
Okay.
So I came from a rural background, a working class background, if that's how if that's the correct determination. One wealthy by the standards that people use, but we had what we needed. And the most important thing my parents taught us, 3 things my parents taught us, was that we had to save money, buy property, and get an education. And trust God to help us and believe God. That's my background.
Okay. Thank you, Sister Valerie. So I think now we understand why you're one of the few scholars who study African American rural people. I mean, to be honest with you, not just contemporary, but historically,
Hmm.
there have not been a lot of black folk who have studied rural people. In fact, there's not been very many studies on rural people. There's clearly an urban bias. And one of the things I'm struck by is that as we sit here talking today, nationally, nearly 1 in 5 black folk live in a rural community, right?
Hmm.
And in the South, it's nearly 1 in 4, 24%. So the rural experience remains a deeply rooted and ongoing experience for black folk. So what I'd like you to do is discuss the past and the continuing importance of the Black rural experience, and I want you specifically to build on, your publications, particularly the emphasis on Black self-determination that you talk about in a piece that you did. And I hope I'm not taking you way back in time, but a piece you wrote, I think, 96, African American rural, no, 2003, African American rural culture, 1900 to 1950, and a piece that I really loved. I always have liked it, trying to make ends meet. My grandma used to talk about that. Trying to make ends meet, African American women on Brooks Farm, 1920 to 1930. So if you can use those pieces as a kind of jumping off point to talk about the significance of the Black rural experience in the past and in the contemporary moment.
Okay. So, in fact, let me start with trying to make ends meet, African American women in Brooks Farm. Let me just say a little bit about Brooks Farm, because Brooks Farm was, um, it was a landed estate, as I will call it, a big plantation in Mississippi that was started by a man named P.H. Brooks. And around 1910, 1920, he started buying land in Mississippi, early 1900, 1903, but he engaged in a lot of other business enterprise. But after that, he decided he wanted to go into plantation agriculture. And what he decided he wanted to do a little bit different than what most Southern white planters was doing this time, did was that he wanted to put together an operation that has some kind of economic mobility attached to it. And that was, he wanted to bring black people in as laborers, as tenants, as renter, and even some as sharecroppers, with the idea that at the point in which wanted to get out of farming, he would make the land available to them. So this happened in Brooks Farm, which is situated between Leaflore and Sunflower counties, where down in the Delta in Mississippi, where I grew up. And so essentially, you're talking about um, thousands of acres of land that eventually become owned by blacks. Black families largely own this land. He was a big family man in the sense of trying to help blacks who wanted to move forward in agriculture own land as family units. The women who moved into those spaces with their husbands and extended family had played a tremendous role in helping to carve that space out as an agriculture commercial site. And as a result of that, a lot of their time was spent trying to make ends meet, trying to help their husbands
Hmm.
um, get those crops in, raise those children, grow the food, sell things. They would sell things that they had that came in more abundance than they could use, because they were going to need that extra money in order to pay taxes on land, in order to continue to develop the milk business, the egg business, and things of that sort. And so I started there with the idea of thinking about the intersection of what black womanism and black patriarchy look like in a landed
Mm.
space. And my argument is that land was the thing that made life between black men and black women a little more different than probably what I would say was happening in some urban space, simply because
Okay,
of
let me stop you for a moment. I got to get you to shift to the right
I
because
can't.
you're about to go off screen on me. All
Okay.
right, get back to that. So land made the difference in mitigating gender relations. How so?
Because it was impossible to own that land, to sustain that land without the help of the women. And the women were doing jobs on the farm and sometimes off the farm to help keep the land. And as a result of that, they saw that land as much as their homes, homeland, their property, as did their men. That doesn't mean that there wasn't patriarchy that existed, because these are Southern Baptist Christian men who believed in that male thing, like every
You
other
too
man.
nice.
But they were folks who recognized this is what is incredible about farms with black family. They realized they couldn't make that farm work if their wives were not involved in the farm enterprise. And so in that sense, um, I started to think about trying to make end meet, um, thinking about the intersection of sort of black male patriarchy and black womanism in landed space, right? And so, and
Mhm.
I'm talking here from about 1920. By 1920, that land had been cleared. Families had begun to move to Brooks Farm. It was evolving as a huge landed agriculture space. So in between, after that, then I start to think about what did you do after work. And I'm very interested in understanding cultural grounding. How did people ground
Mhm.
themselves in such a way that this land became their home place? So I started to think a little bit about what did you do? What were the first thing that you asked for land in order to make yourself feel like you were building a community? Then I had people talk to me about, we demanded space for a cemetery. We demanded space to build school. We demanded space to have church. And so that's the culture I'm talking about. The
So
culture of,
institution building.
huh? Yes.
Institution building.
Absolutely. Institution building. That if you can build institution where you are, is more likely than not you going to stay there. And they were working with a white man who owned that land, who understood that in order for them to be productive so that he would also make money in that his partnership with them, he had to concede that kind of thinking, that he had to understand from their point of view what community meant to them. And so that's what the
Mhm.
rural culture piece is about. So moving um, from 1900 to the 1950, right before integration and that push for civil rights movement, looking at the cultural value of black people around land, around space, talking about the importance of something like a store porch on a rural storefront. How on the one hand it was a site for business and exchange, but on the other, for black folks, it could be a place to conduct business. It could be a place to have a social meeting and things of that
Mhm.
sort. And then the third piece that you ask about in terms of black self-determinism, that's a piece that really looked at how black people saw land not only as a way to make money, but every person who owned land saw land as what I call a nation state place. It was their own nation. It was their space. It was a space where the boundaries that they had built around them was their security, was their autonomy. And so
Mhm.
it's an
Mhm.
idea that owning land gave you the best opportunity to become self-determining. And that's how they were able to build the things I talked about early that made it work for rural children who lived in those spaces. And so those three pieces then became foundational to me understanding why the fight for black land by black folks was so critical, why they was fighting. This wasn't just to be able to say my grandfather owned the land 100 years ago, and that was important. It was about understanding this is the only way that you maintain culture, that you maintain your own way of thinking about what patriarchy and gender roles and gender would look like. You're determining that. And this was the way to think about what you wanted to do in an autonomous kind of way, what you want to grow. You might not want to grow cotton. You just simply might want to have wheat and let the rest lay by. How you want to participate. But more than anything else, land was about autonomy and protection. and being able to protect yourself, being able to use certain laws to say, don't trespass. If you come on my land, you violating my rights and things of that sort. And so this piece that you're talking about, black self-determinism, is about understanding how land was fundamental the way that they found protection.
That was wonderful. That was absolutely wonderful. And I want to raise this question. It's probably the kind of obvious question, but Du Bois argues that by 1900, black people had gained ownership over 15 million acres of land. I think the last time I looked, and you can correct me if I'm off, but I'm thinking that we're down to 2 million.
Around between 2012 2017, we were down to 2 million, but might be even less now. And it was in 1915, there were 875,000 black farmers who owned 15 million acres of land, and it's been declining for various reasons ever since then. You're right when you say we're down to 2 million and less. It's a reason why it's something I don't understand in terms of how much resources we got. I don't understand why somebody would buy $1 million Lamborghini and not buy land. And so
I agree with you, but
you understand.
But before we get to there, can you explain?
You understand? Looking good is important. I get it. But go ahead.
You. I absolutely hear you. Why somebody would buy 19 cars? Can you talk about the process? As you said, there's many ways, but going from 15 million acres of land, and I don't want to muddy this up, but what's coming into my mind, right, is that we also owned 110 hospitals, right, 300 or 400 pharmacies. The period in which the most black banks were built, I guess now it's the second largest, is in that period between 1900 and 1940. And so, how do you account for us being somewhat relatively better situated, seeing the land decline? Can you talk about those processes that are that are responsible for that? The role of the society, white folks, and our role as well.
Yes, that's a great question. And we have some, we have to own some of this too, right? So for example, those institutions that you spoke about, the number of banks that black folks built. So we do know there was that in our history, or in American history, there were all kinds of attacks. If you look at a place like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood, Rosewood, Florida, for example. So you got a lot of examples where black people were burned out and land was taken from them. You got other example where when Ida B. Well talked about the lynching of black folks and this whole foolishness about black men raping white women, that she did an investigation that showed that really the folks who were being largely lynched were black folks who own land and property, because these were the folks, white folks want to run out the South and just take over their land. So we have some of that too. And then we can't discount the impact of migration of black folks from the South and from those rural areas in terms of taking their resources to other parts of the country. And so that diminished the amount of resources that were available going to black banks. But then sometimes black banks were also undermined by federal policies and just by schemes that politicians and others were running in those southern states. But I think one of the things to think about is that for those of us who had land, sometimes we didn't pay enough attention to it, in the sense that we will go away and forget you got to pay the taxes. Let me tell you something. Every time a black person dies, I'm telling you, somebody white is at the courthouse asking for the deed. They want to see who's on the deed. If you're a singular person on the deed, then they start approaching you. If it's multiple people on the deed, let's just say your parents die and there's no will, so it goes to everybody. They start
Mm-hmm.
working the brokest person in the family, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they intend to offer that person some dollars that might sound like a lot of money if you broke, buy in and then force a sale of the land. So those schemes were used. And then can't forget about eminent domain. Black lands were just taken. That's a problem they have in Tennessee right now, where Ford is building that new um, plant. I think it's maybe, I don't know if it's a chip plant, but Ford is building a new plant in Tennessee. And the plant goes directly through the land of some of the black farmers. Right now, they fighting to try to get fair prices for their land. And
Mm-hmm.
all Ford wants to do, well, offers $3,500. The land is worth $35,000 an acre easily. And so now they taking these black farmers to court to take part of their land for eminent domain. So land was lost in that way. And then other time land was lost because of foreclosure. Sometimes the farmer just had a couple of bad crops and couldn't get the debt paid. But more than anything, it was the discrimination in the implementation of federal farm policy in the post New Deal era, where you had the what they called back then the FHA, the Farmers Home Administration,
Mm-hmm.
the Agriculture Stabilization Conservation, and then they had these local committees in these counties that were responsible for approving the loan. Well, all the committee was staffed by white farmers who took care of
Yeah.
themselves first, and then their little working class white farmer buddy second. And then when black folks applied for loan, they either didn't get them, got them in June or July, got them too late, and they didn't get enough in order to help them make a profitable crop. And so these are the scenarios that led to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I want to jump to the contemporary moment, right?
Okay.
So, during and since the 1990s, black farmers have been protesting the ongoing discrimination in the USDA that you were speaking to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Federal loans. And this results in a consent decree coming out of the Pickford versus Glickman decision,
Mm-hmm.
in which the federal government promises to pay black farmers $2 billion in debt relief and to get the suit settled. So, first question is, did we get paid?
So
Don't answer though. Don't answer yet. Don't answer
okay.
yet. Because then I want to go to the fact that on March 1st, last month, black farmers were in DC
Mm-hmm.
protesting again, right? Led by this group, uh, the Black Belt Justice Center, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they got signs that say things like no check, no vote. We can no longer support the Democratic Party under these conditions, and no more auction block. And this is just last month, black farmers rallying in DC. And this time they're protesting the fact that Biden was supposedly in his $1.9 trillion stimulus package was going to pay black farmers for their past abuse, right? And then a group of white farmers sues and it gets blocked. So black farmers haven't gotten anything. Can you just bring us up to date on on the struggle of black farmers and why it matters for us?
So back in the name, I worked that case. I was in DC doing a lot of that protesting with black farmers. So in that first class action lawsuit, I worked that case with a group of black farmers. In fact, I was the only scholar in that case. Couldn't really get black folks, black scholar riled up to be interested in that movement. In fact, that was to me the last big social movement of the 20th century. Black farmers in the streets. So we marched in the streets in D.C., Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago, on behalf of black farmers. And the issue there was the discrimination that black farmers have been experiencing in the USDA really all their lives, but especially since the 1980s when Ronald Reagan banned the U.S. Commission and they destroyed some of the evidence that was sent there to support their case. However, in
You're talking
1990,
about when Reagan tried to eliminate the
the
Civil
Civil
Rights
Rights
Commission.
Commission, yes,
Okay.
yes, and so
Yeah.
that's why when the judge certified that lawsuit in Pickman versus Glitman, it went back to that time period, to that time period in 1982, I think, when the Civil Rights Commission was disbanded, and what people said was that there have been dis- protest letters coming to the Civil Rights Commission for some time, but those letters was that evidence got destroyed. But nevertheless, the judge certified the lawsuit. We had listening session all over the country, and farmers could sign up to participate in the lawsuit. It was not a typical class action. You had to kind of in one part of it, in the beef track, you had to prove that you were discriminated against it because you could sue for a larger amount of money. In the A track, you can just decide that the government would say, we accept a witness testifying to what you said, and you get a flat $50,000. That's how that was supposed to be. And then the federal government was supposed to pay the income taxes on the $50,000, so the farmers wouldn't have to pay that. So as a result of that, that suit got settled with track A and track B. So yes, a considerable number of people got paid in track in their first lawsuit. But then there were a group of farmers who alleged that by the time that they got the information, the deadline for signing up for the first lawsuit had passed. So they reopened it. Then we get a pick for two under the Obama administration. So Obama administration pushed, and the judge certified a second lawsuit. And as a result,
Wait a minute. You told me Obama did something good for black folks? Okay. That's good information. Good to know.
the second one happened under Obama. And so I think it was 2010, as a matter of fact. And so what his administration did was set aside between 1.5 and $2 billion for black farmers who didn't get a chance to participate doing what they call the first in pick for one. So there's a pick for one and a pick for two. And the pick for two, farmers went back, and the ones who didn't get a chance were able to get some of that settlement money doing pick for two. And there still is a story out there, belief out there, that all the money that comprised pick for two wasn't spent. So what the farmers are asking now is that instead of waiting on that 1.9 money coming from the $1.9 trillion stimulus package, pretty much that Biden set up, that they be allowed to get the money that's remaining in pick for two. So that March 1 thing you talking about, I was supposed to be at that meeting, but I couldn't get there on time at the time when they were going to be meeting with some of the senators and people like that, because I was tied up somewhere else. So nevertheless, I continue to be engaged in this conversation with people and talking to people, and I would do some work this summer in that direction. Long story short is that money that was supposed to be a part of the Biden release plan got hijacked by this stupid reverse discrimination claim that white farmers were making just to hold up the money. And as a result of that, the farmers have not gotten into that money. So people like John Boyd, who leads the National Black Farmers Alliance, are asking Biden to do something with his power in order to release this money, because black farmers are, according to John Boyd, are still facing discrimination in the implementation of farm policy, and also are continuing to lose land. And so that's where we are. Those signs you were talking about, yes, I was aware that those signs were coming, and some even more horribly than that that they were put up. So they are gearing up again to fight again for black farmers. Now this time they may have a little more support, because now at least a couple of years ago, the agriculture committee was headed by an African American members of the House of Representatives, I believe. So that's where we are. That there's this continuous effort to get fairness in the implementation of farm policy.
Wow, it's and the thing that strikes me, your point that the last major social movement of the 20th century might have, in terms of Black America, might have been the movement of the farmers. Uh, how do we make the struggle of Black farmers and the struggle for land, right, central again in the Black liberation movement and to Black folks? Because it really isn't on the radar. How do we get it back center?
That's a critical question. I have been trying to work through Black Land Grants Institution to push this issue out into communities, right? Because Black Land Grant institutions have outreach wings through extension,
Mm-hmm.
through farm demonstration, through conferences, through other kinds of things. And part of their work involves going out into the community, talking about the state of African American rural life and agricultural life, which includes farming. And so I've been trying to encourage the outreach coordinators at Black Land Grants to start working with local people in the community, the NAACP, the local pastor, the local school teachers, having these conversations in places where Black folks have power, in your basement of your churches, in your beauty shops, wherever there may be some space, informing Black people of the opportunities that exist with land ownership. You can be the poorest person on the corner, and if somebody gets you connected to the USDA, I've seen white guys go from rubbing 2 pennies to rubbing billions of dollars, millions of dollars together, because the agriculture production and farming is the most subsidized welfare in the country. It is the most rich welfare program in the country. This money that the federal government be giving to people to start farming
Mm-hmm.
is farming, and you need it. A tractor costs $100,000,
Yeah.
and so that's just one. And then you need a whole bunch of other stuff. And so I think that what we have to do is continually try to put Black farmers on our social agendas, our political agenda, and start having this conversation, not necessarily about farming, but about the value of land. That's the conversation we need to have. Even when I'm talking to my nieces and nephew, when I mention the word farmer, they stay off into space like a deer in headlight. And then I have to remind them that I wasn't calling for them to be the new generation slaves. I'm not talking about picking cotton. I tell them, I said, I'm not asking you to pick cotton. I'm asking you to understand. I'm asking you to go
Oh,
to a land grant school and take advantage of all that science, technology, engineering, and other things that exist in land grant school. It's amazing because land grant schools are line items in the federal budgets. They're gonna get some funding.
Valerie, you about to bust my brain because I'm thinking about these idiots who were pitching Bitcoin as a solution to Black people's economic problem,
Yeah.
and as opposed to buying land.
Yes,
I
yes,
mean, it borders on a kind of a criminal stupidity, doesn't it?
it really does. I say to people, listen, just start with 2 acres. You'll be amazed at, if you sit on 2 acres, the value of how that increases. And that's more importantly, what I'm trying to do is work with Black people mindset. We spend all our money giving it to everybody else in everybody community, and we have nothing to show for it but depreciating items. $500
Mhm.
gym shoes, rims on cars. Rims on
I
cars
know.
that nobody gonna buy. It's just craziness. And so I think we have to start talking about it as building intergenerational wealth. Use the word land ownership and property acquisition so that they can hear value instead of labor. That's the conversation I'm trying to have with my nieces and nephews. That I'm talking intergenerational wealth building, having value. I'm not talking about you throwing a cotton sack across your back singing Old Man River. We're not getting ready to do that.
Oh boy. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So I want to turn to an incident that you've experienced and that many of us in academia and out of academia have experienced of late, particularly since what I like to say, Donald Trump rolled the rock from from the cave, and all of these creatures have slithered out. So in 2017, you were the victim of a racist hate crime. Identity Evropa, which is that white nationalist group that wants to convince everybody that everything of value came from Europe. They placed flyers depicting Michelangelo's David with the phrase, "Let's become great again," um, on your office door, and on the whiteboard on your office, they wrote their name, their symbol, and their Twitter handle in an effort to intimidate you.
Mm-hmm.
And I can, in talking about the way in which you were raised and the kind of mantra that your parents gave you to live by, that was the way you responded. So can you talk about your response to that hate group? But then can you also talk about, beyond you, the individual, Dr. Valerie Grimm, um, this current attack that takes the form of targeting us as individuals? How should we respond to hate crimes and white vigilante actions?
Okay, yeah. So in 2017, I had the incident that you just reference, and it story was carried in the New York Times, and I think in that um, conversation with that writer, I simply said that um, I wasn't afraid, and that I think I also indicated that whoever you are, you welcome. Don't hide behind the board. Knock on the door. Come in and let's have a conversation. Because I am not afraid to talk about who I am, this department where I teach, and what our content concerns. And so what that led to, I got responses from people. I mean, folks from Europe wrote me, sent me emails, and they were like,
Mm,
um, I want to talk. They call me. Can I talk to you? I live in Europe. I can't come in and knock on your door. And since you issued this invitation to come in, so let's talk. I said, okay, what do you want to talk about? And so uh, the conversations from them were mostly about me understanding that this is about their culture, and they wanted people to understand their culture, and they wanted me to appreciate the culture that they had come from, and they wanted me to understand how proud they were of their culture, and also that they thought the way that I thought about things was antiquated, outdated, and necessarily kind of essentially border on chaos and causing confusion. And so I let them talk, and I responded by saying part of what you represent um, is about rewriting the narrative, and your narrative is to say that everything great came from you, that no other culture, no other people had anything to do with it. And I said to them, I would never teach that, I would never tell that as a narrative, and I'm not going to engage in this conversation if this is what you want to talk about. And
mhm.
so at some I ended the conversation abruptly. Other I tried to hear out. Some I think somebody called me um, about the political culture back during that time, and wanted me to understand. It was concerned about me and wanted me to go get a gun. And this was a white guy, and said that things were going to get rough out there, and that he would just concerned. This person was from Mississippi, wanted me to get a gun and buy up 500 rounds and be ready for when they come. It was just madness. And so, but I think that when you decide, at least my mindset is, when you decide you're going to teach anything that deals with epistemologically understanding who Black people are, centering Black people's narratives in their own story, in their expressions as their own subject, you are already, by that positionality, intellectual positionality, disrupting the story. There's nothing that you're going to get from that, from folks who don't want to hear that, but chaos. You're going to get what you're getting from DeSantis. You don't want people's story to exist, because the existence of our story is the voice of our achievement, as well as a critique of what they have done.
That's right. That's right.
And that is what they don't want the world to know. The kinds of things that were done against Black folks in order to keep Black people from realizing that they too have achieved and can achieve. And so this is what this is about. So you keep force feeding them some illusion that you great, everything about you is great. There's nothing about your history. And so what I try to tell students who study in African American studies is that I'm not the professor who's going to blame you for what your foreparents did or what happened in the past. But I am the professor who will say there is some accountability that we all have to bear today. And that while you didn't enslave anybody, you must understand the benefit of the enslavement of other to whiteness. And if you can't understand that, then there is a problem in how we are educating in this country. And so to answer your question, we have to be true to what we know to be our trauma, our achievement, and we must never surrender memory. We must always keep memory alive. And that is what DeSantis doesn't want. He doesn't want the memory of Black people to function as part of the way in which we engage who we are and where we have come from. And so as long as we remember, we'll be okay, because that requires us to keep teaching. And if we keep teaching, we will disrupt the narrative, the lone narrative, which is a lie, the lone narrative of Black inferiority. We will not only disrupt that, we are going to dismantle that continuously.
Thank you, Valerie. Now, these are not just words that you're speaking, because you led NCBS into the Lion's Den a month ago.
Yeah.
Y'all went to Gainesville, Florida, University of Florida, and held the 47th annual conference of the National Council for Black Studies. So you're there in the Lion's Den. What was it like? What did NCBS do? Was there any response on the part of the fascist state of Florida?
So we went to Florida. So when this story was breaking, we had already planned to be in Florida for the meeting. So the question from some people came whether or not we were going to still hold our conference. And my position was, sometimes you just have to run to the fire, and you do. And so to say what it is.
Let me stop you there. That's the same position, ASALH, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We're holding our 108th conference in Jacksonville, Florida, September 20th through the 24th. And the Florida NAACP is calling for what they call a travel alert, which is short of a boycott. And we're trying to say, no, we're coming to
Mm-hmm.
fight.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to abandon our people
Mm-hmm.
behind enemy lines. Yeah.
So we felt the same way. So before we got there, we issued a statement. NCBS issued a statement. We took on that issue of this craziness about African American history and this claim that it has no educational value. So we issued a statement across the country before we went. And then inside the program bulletin, I issued another statement that was sent ahead. When we got there, there were a group of people who protested and organized a protest and and moved around the campus. And
Mhm.
so we had reporters in giving we were giving interviews. We were talking about why we were there, what we were accomplishing, and anybody who wanted to come could come, and we would talk with them. So what we did was to say we're not running from this fight, and that as a result of that, um, we were prepared to stand up for ourselves in Florida and to stand up for Black studies in Florida. We joined
Mhm.
some colleagues there, and we stood with them. And so I think that the message was clear. We were not going to go anywhere else but to Gainesville. And that's where we went. And we went on the campus of the University of Florida. And we had a very good conference. Just a fantastic conference. No, we didn't have any
Right.
problems. Nobody came trying to run us out of the conference
Mm.
center or anything. Nobody showed up by us. And we were in the newspaper. We were on the local news.
You know,
So
it matters when you say you will fight.
yeah.
It matters because oftentimes they just smacking their lips. So good, 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 good. So I want to I want to ask you if you could talk about NCBS. I'm not sure that everyone in the audience knows the history of NCBS, um, but if you could basically talk about the organization, give its history, some of the current programming, and make a pitch for folk to join,
Okay.
essentially.
So NCBS are acronyms for the National Council for Black Studies. The organization was established in 1975. So this is after a lot of the student movements had happened on college campus. The civil rights movement, Black Power movement had come to a not to a close, but definitely was not as aggressive as it had been in the 1970s. But the purpose of the organization was to formalize a way of studying the experiences of African world people, Black people
Hmm.
in the United States and Black people in the African diaspora throughout the world. Our goal was and is to integrate higher education in such a way that people come to understand the experiences of Black people on Black people's terms, understanding how we study, not just tell facts about Black folks and what has happened to Black people, but how we study Black people. And I think the whole idea here is to be able to engage in an intellectual enterprise where we differentiate between what a study of Black folks is and just knowing facts about Black people. Now that's important because NCBS has a community responsibility. It has a community responsibility in the sense that we are to be socially engaged and we are to
Hmm.
care about the community of people we represent. So it's not about us just using our intellectual skills to write and do research in order to promote our careers, but we are to also take the research and data we find and we collect and take it to the community to try to help the community better understand how it can address some issues that the people of those communities are confronting. And so it is a national organization. We have members from every state of the United States. We have members who are a faculty member at big Research One schools, smaller schools, some of the smaller liberal arts school, comprehensive school. All kinds of folks exist in in the National Council for Black Studies. We
And
have
then you also have student
oh,
memberships, right?
absolutely.
Graduate and undergraduate.
Yes, and we have great presence among students. What we try to do is to begin the work of research and community development um, with undergraduates, teaching undergraduates how to do research in their classes, put together a team, partner with a professor, come to conference and begin understanding how you have a conversation about Black people, how you raise that question, how you pose that argument. So we really do push that undergraduate and graduate training, as well as offer opportunities to people who are already professors. We have a website. You can go on to that website. You can just type in National Council of Black Studies and it will come up. You can find the page of what kind of membership we have, institutional, individual, life membership, and things of that sort. We'll be happy to have you because we are trying to build the next generation of scholars, activists, policymaker, and people who are very concerned about what's happening to African descended people throughout the world.
Thank you, Dr. Grimm. Now, we've got some questions that are
Okay.
showing up in the chat. But
Okay.
before we go to questions, the Maryland has made several very positive comments about how the experience you spoke to mirrors her own life. So, Marilyn, if you wanted to put in a more descriptive comment, I would welcome that. Or if you wanted to specifically put in a question, I welcome that. And when you do, we'll get directly to it. But here's the question that we have from Park Anarchists. And the question is does Dr. Grimm have an opinion on the work of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives slash Land Assistance Fund?
Yes, I'm familiar with the Federation of Southern Cooperative. In fact, back when in the 90s, did some work with them in Detroit. I think when we got invited there by Conyers for a rally dealing with the Black farmers. In my experience with the federation, it has done a lot of good work. I really appreciate the work it is doing now around heirs property. If you know anything about the heirs property struggle among African American as it pertains to land ownership, you would know that's a very important issue in terms of Black people trying to maintain their land and not be undermined by um, uh, heirs' rights, the rights of family members who get exploited by wealthy people in terms of buying them out in order to force a sale of their land. So yes, I'm familiar with them. They do a lot of work around land resistance and trying to help Black farmers hold on to their land. And they do work as well as outreaching to Black farmers to provide them with the most up-to-date knowledge. They hold conferences, they hold meetings. It's a very engaged organization.
Valerie, on this question of cooperatives, the little bit of reading I've done in terms of African American rural communities, particularly during and after Reconstruction, suggests that in addition to individual land ownership, a lot of Black families combined to buy land that they formed cooperatively. Can you speak to the cooperative movement in Black farming? Because I know that Monica White's book Freedom Farmers also talks about that trend. So what can you tell us about that trend? Dr. Grimm, I think you're frozen. Okay, let me see. Is there a way for me to refresh her? She's gone for the moment. We'll wait for her to return. and I'll keep struggling. Excuse me. I haven't. I'm looking for it now. Let me find. Yeah. I see the question. What made you begin this work in African study as opposed to urban populations? Okay. We'll get to it as soon as Dr. Grimm is able to come back. Let me um, text her. Make sure, see if I can send her the link again. All right, let me jump in here and get the link again in case she's lost the link. Okay, I sent that to her. So let me see if there are any generic kinds of questions that I can kind of take up and raise. Um, no comments. I probably should have got her phone number. Hmm. Okay. So let me kind of fill the time here while we're waiting for Dr. Grimm to rejoin us. Monica White published a book called Freedom Farms in about 2018, 2019 or so, which looked at Black farm communities going back to the post Reconstruction era. And one of the things that she was able to discover was that Tuskegee under Booker T, well, we know the whole history of betrayal, but that, okay, Valerie is back.
I'm on myself. I don't know what happened to my computer, so I'm gonna have to do this here.
Okay, we're glad you're back. So Marilyn put forward a question specifically, and the question is this: Dr. Grimm, what made you begin this work in Africana studies as opposed to urban populations? What has kept you centered on the rural experience of African Americans?
Um, what has kept me centered has been the way in which I understand the power of land and the need for Black studies to have a serious rural studies component as
Mm-hmm.
part of its overall intellectual enterprise and content. And what also centers me is because I understand how land works
in the American mindset. That is, if it is owned by individual, or if it is overwhelmingly owned by a certain community of people, that means that that group of people are going to be very difficult to remove from power,
Mm,
because land is the most powerful resource in the country. You need it to build anything you want to establish in the country. I have not focused that much on urban populations, because I feel like the rural experiences of Black people is fundamental to understanding the inner city problem and the urban struggles of Black folks. The many of the Black folks who struggle in the rural areas of the South, who work as laborers on farm, just simply became factory workers in the city, facing the same kind of system of dominance and oppression and economic exploitations.
and I think you're right. So Marilyn has a follow-up question, which is, how can we better serve rural African American children when it comes to not just history, but building, period, when so much is urban centered?
I think that in the places where images of Black people are represented, um, media, popular culture, we have to encourage those who have the microphone, who have the cameras in front of them, to also understand that there's a tremendous number of Black people still living in the South, living in small towns, as we discussed earlier, who don't see themselves represented in the image in the images of America. That is some work that we can do. That's the work that we can do in our art. That's the work we can do in our productions. And so I think we have to take the lead in valuing rural Black people. In our history, there's always um, in our history, there's always been this sense that there's the city folks in the country bunker, right? That you
Yeah.
know how people, you say, oh, you so country. So there's been a lot of
Mhm.
shaming of folks who come from rural areas, to make them feel like that they didn't have enough class to be included and involved in
Mhm.
things that's going on in our community. So I think we have to change our attitudes about how we think about rural African Americans. We have to do that. And then we have to represent them in the things that we're doing, or
So
include them
many
in
of
the
us.
things. Hmm?
Well, just thinking about my life. My people were rural people, and they moved to an urban place, but they kept a number of those rural practices. So my grandmother always had this huge garden, and as children, we had to work in the
Hmm.
garden. And as you say, that they've developed a kind of disdain
Hmm.
for it. But when I think back about, my childhood and the community I grew up in, the food we got out of that garden was really tasted good. And you could walk through any alley in the Black community. There were peaches, apples, grapes,
Hmm.
apricots, rhubarb, every
Hmm.
kind of thing. And to a small degree, that helped create a bit of autonomy from, direct U.S. capital.
Hmm.
And now we are very much dependent on the bad food that they target us for. And we now have the diseases that's a consequence of having moved away from
Hmm.
some of those rural values. So you got a couple other questions here, and this is from Quark Anarchist. And the question is there something 4-H can do to support rural Black youth to reduce shame or stigma?
Sure, there is. And 4-H is very active in doing that. I think the issue is we got to get our children to 4-H. Um, it's amazing the kind of educational things that are offered through 4-H, not only dealing with, animal husbandry and food production, but they got STEM programs in 4-H
Oh,
now.
yeah.
These land grant school got some extraordinary 4-H programs, particularly the big Research One land grant schools. Those 4-H summer programs are like going to a, a small junior college at some lower level
That's
because
right.
of what they offer.
That's right.
So we just got to get our children to them. I was visiting family members in Minnesota, and I was doing some research at the University of Minnesota. I went to the outreach center, the 4-H outreach center, and I asked for summer programming. And I looked at that stuff, and I went back in the Black community. I said, "Hey, do you know they offering media classes for 4-H children 13 years old? Do you know that
Mhm.
nobody knew what the heck I was talking about?" And I started to say, this is the kind of stuff that you can get your kids to free, that gives them all kind of
That's
opportunity
right.
to be exposed. And so again, I think we have to help the land grant schools spread the message. And the message cannot be about farming in a traditional kind of is in a traditional sense. It has to be helping the kids understand the value of skill development. That if you acquire skills, you'll be able to provide a way to earn a living, to take care of yourself. And so we first of all got to do the work in our community to find out what institutions in our community got 4-H outreach programs, and they have them in a lot of different locations. And after that, we got to convince parents to let their children go, to get involved.
Thank you for that answer. I want to throw something at you. Um, I've been slowly working on a study of Soul City, which Floyd McKissick designed to be a black town that he was developing in a modern sense. And while there's a lot of questions about that, what I was struck is that McKissick argued as early as '69 that black people should strategically begin moving back into the South. And what he was looking for was that if black folks could become a majority in 2 or 3 southern states, that we could then operate those states because of U.S. federalism, right? We could take the stance of states' rights, flip it, and develop autonomy in those areas. And so he was calling for a return migration in the late '60s, and we know that the return migration has begun, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly a larger percentage of black people living in the South than there were in the '80s. We've seen the percentage, begin to move up, but these people largely go to urban areas. But the way in which white people are using the system, both in terms of what the capitalists are doing and what their political lackeys are doing, they're pushing us out of the cities. Everywhere in the United States, we've been pushed into the city. We've been pushed out of the cities into the suburban areas. And in the South, those suburban areas are really rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that we could organize a conscious movement to the South and to rural areas where we can acquire land and different levels of autonomy? Maybe not an independent nation state, but we can use the system of federalism in our interests to be more autonomous.
I think it almost sounds like a Afrofuturistic kind of idea, but and I say this because um, what will be required is for that to work would be a huge landed area where people
Hmm.
could build up and develop and produce in such a way that they can sustain their autonomy. one of the things I have found in this reverse migration, in that blacks in urban spaces are also finding, is won't anybody sell them any land? Not enough land to do what you talking about. So if they come back, they might be coming back to maybe to Atlanta, to Chattanooga, to some of the urban spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But if then that is to happen, it'll have to happen with a a a, a revolutionary black nationalist
Mindset.
mindset in the inner city where black folks already are, and so that
So
they
we are being pushed out of the inner cities.
that's right. And so that's my point, being pushed out of the inner city. Nobody in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi selling large swaths of land for that purpose will make it very difficult for that idea to be realized. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think if that idea is to happen, it probably will have to be conceived more in terms of in the existing structure. Like, for example, when you think about the Mississippi Delta, where I come from, some of those counties got some black majorities,
That's
right?
right. A lot of them.
And so what it's going to take is to get into an existing structure and work on the ground, building a kind of black nationalist mindset where people understand the common goal is to be able to move in this direction, so that we, first of all, we can elect people from our own areas. It's, in Mississippi, you can be 75% black and never have a black representative. So we got a lot of work to do with our own people in developing that kind of mindset that will help all of us understand we can build something where we can operate stretches of power. Maybe not all over the state, but in some areas.
You know, um, just as a Black studies scholar who uses historical methodologies, I think about the Exodusters. I think about the Great Black March West,
Yes,
1910
yes,
to
yes.
1920. Well, I should say 1890 to 1910. And we're talking about the building of those all black towns out in the West. And particularly, I'm thinking about the notion that was put forward by Edward McCabe that black folks could go into Kansas strategically, uh, Oklahoma, strategically take over different voting districts.
Mhm.
And his goal was for black folk to do in Oklahoma, right, when it went from territory to state, what the Mormons had done in Utah.
Right,
And it would be hard to argue that Utah isn't a Mormon state,
right,
right?
right.
That operates within and without U.S. law.
So the Mormons, they took over Salt Lake City. They took over a lot of big space. They didn't they took over big enough space in the most central spaces, whereas even if they weren't in other parts, everybody think of Utah as a Mormon state,
That's
right?
right. They were able to
And
still control the politics and the
that's
economics of
right.
it. Yeah.
And so when you think about the Mississippi Delta, so many of those Mississippi Delta towns, Ruval, Drew, Cleveland,
Hmm.
these are black majority spaces. And if we could in some way help our people understand the power just in numbers, and work together to try to a define common ground among us, so that those who work together at different live together at different economic classes can come together and find some unified idea that will make all of us strong. There was an idea in the Mississippi Delta, north of Mississippi, when you come from Memphis and you head through Tunica County, all the way
Hmm.
down the stretch of the Mississippi River. That was one time envisioned as New Africa, right? So there's a
Oh
little
yeah. Yeah.
sign in Mississippi called, right in the Delta, called New
Yeah.
Africa outside
Yeah.
Cleveland. And I'm
Yeah, no,
thinking,
no, no. I mean, the Republic of New Africa still has that dream, and many
yeah,
of us share it.
yeah,
So, the one last question for you, and then I want you to kind of give closing statements, make any announcements of upcoming events. But
okay.
the question comes from Breaking Ground. Oh, excuse me. That's not the question I want. The question comes from James Regler, and he says he's curious if you know anything about Bassfield, Mississippi. Do you have any people there? I suspect James might.
So
B
is it
A S Bass, as in like the fish,
uh-huh.
Bassfield, Mississippi.
Bass Hill. Okay. No, I don't. I thought at first I thought you said something else. No, I don't. I don't know anything. Where's it? Ask him to put in the chat where is it located close to?
James, put in the chat uh,
The nearest
what
town, the nearest
towns
city.
Bassfield is close to, and some ideas it in the northern, central, where it is. All right. While James is putting that in the chat, can you any announcements, any closing, concluding comments that you want to leave the audience with? You got 4 minutes.
Okay. So I don't have an announcement other than the fact that I will encourage you all to go on to the National Council of Black Studies page, because we are beginning a series of programs that we'll be posting in terms of deadlines and opportunities there. And one of the things that we will be having conversations about really concerns the study of Black people and what's going on probably with um, AP African American Studies. And I like to close by just encouraging us to remind ourselves of where we come from, that we come from a great people, and that we have done amazingly great things in spite of the hardships and just the effort to totally traumatize us. And here's the one thing I like for us to remember, which is what white oppression and white domination has not been able to do completely. It has not been able to break our spirit. As
That's
long as
right.
we don't allow this stuff to break our spirit, we have a chance. It might physically tax us, and yes, we get tired. And I'm going to encourage us not to internalize the madness of whiteness, throw it back on the people who created it, let them have it. Don't you have the nervous breakdown? And so, but that we remember that what brought us through was the fact that our foreparents and our parents did not give up their spirit. And that is what's going to sustain us even now. Don't lose hope, and don't let your spirit get broken.
Tyler, we still have a few minutes, so I do want you to respond to a couple of questions.
Okay.
And one is first, some information. James says that it is an hour north of Biloxi,
Okay. So no, I
near
didn't spend
Prentice,
a lot of time
off of
down that way.
49.
I don't know it. I know where
Okay.
Biloxi is, but I didn't spend a lot of time in that part of that southern Mississippi from where I live. That's south of me.
Okay. Then another question before we go is, can you speak to very quickly, 1 minute, uh, what's your understanding of permaculture and liberation?
Permaculture?
Permacultur, permaculture and liberation.
Hmm. Well, about permaculture, I'm not exactly sure. Um, but liberation, I think of liberation primarily in terms of mindset. That even before anything happens in the physical, the mind has to be liberated. And if you have a liberated mind, which is a mindset that say that you deserve to be free of all oppression, and you deserve to have rights and full opportunities of expression and life and choices, um, that kind of liberation is necessary in order to have a successful physical liberation. Can you ask that person what they mean about permaculture so that I know we're talking about the same
Yes.
thing?
Please put in the chat what you mean by permaculture, and I will forward it to Dr. Grimm. Uh, at this point, it's time for us to move toward, well, let me check it. See what they say. Okay, there's not an answer to that yet. So we're moving toward signing off.
Okay.
Valerie, it is so good. Oh, permaculture, the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems, which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. Permaculture is a growing system that changes the tradition of agriculture.
So I think what I have been following a little more than, not necessarily that, but I've been paying attention to just this whole thing about ecology and other ways in which we have been attempting to engage in um, production, especially. And I'm trying to think of this word. It's where you use water to grow things and you don't need land. Is it aquaponics or something? Anyway, I'm familiar with it slightly, but not enough to probably get into the details that this this colleague wants to know. So I have to think about it a little bit more.
Okay, sounds good. All right, Valerie, I seriously miss you, and
Likewise.
we will we will hook up. And thank you so much.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much. You have, as the young people say, dropped jewels. You're spread knowledge. So I'm going to click you out, and we're going to close out.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, this has been Real Talk History for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Cha-Jua, and our guest has been Dr. Valerie Grimm, President of the National Council for Black Studies. If you type in NCBS or type in National Council for Black Studies, you can go to their website. She is a professor in the Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies at the at Indiana University at Bloomington. Please look her up, give her a chat and email, and let us now end our broadcast.